First of all, we appreciate you coming and joining us in Doha.
Glad to be here.
And I have to say that the panel you're on, I was fascinated by. You were probably the single-minded focus on what is the underlying issue, which is human rights.
Yes.
And how really that understanding of the alienation of people through rights and abuses, especially by state, is one of the major drivers.
Yes.
So would you like to talk a little more from your experience, not only of your previous and being in Belfast, but also more recently issues?
Yeah, so I see human rights in two ways. One is I think that in order to address the production of violence, we have to fundamentally address causes conducive. And it's clear that there are multiple factors that drive individuals and communities to violence. I think we have to think of violence not just as a singular experience, but often as a collective experience. But human rights violations and rule of law limitations are an integral part of that. We know that from ethno-national conflicts. We understand that in the ways in which we address peacekeeping, peacemaking, conflict management, conflict resolutions. We've had decades of that knowledge. It seems to me in the counterterrorism space, we're just actually catching up on that now.
We've only just realised.
Well, it's like we've woken up.
We've woken up to it in this context.
Right, and we've woken up in part because a decade plus of post 9/11, largely hard, if you want, counterterrorism measures, are actually failing to deliver on either an end to the violence and what we're seeing actually as other manifestations, which includes the foreign fighter phenomenon. And it's linking those things. And so the language of preventing violent extremism, the language of countering terrorism as opposed to simply, terrorism as a kind of a static phenomenon, having a more, if you want, nuanced approach, invariably and inevitably engages human rights. And I suppose I would also be clear, I think human rights and security are not two separate things. I think the right to security is embedded in human rights.
It's a human right.
It's a human right. It's a fundamental human right.
If we take it at its most fundamental.
Absolutely, it is. Of course it is. It's recognized in the Universal Declaration in that way. But in parallel, we could be entirely secure in the sense of physical security and have no freedom. And that really is like a colossus with clay feet. It would be meaningless to have security in which one couldn't exercise the most basic components of human expression or movement or family life or freedom of religious expression. So that's why these two things are connected and one invariably informs the other. I think the other thing we are learning a little bit more is that counterterrorism regulation itself has to be human rights compliant. It's not just a conditions conducive question, it's you can't do counterterrorism effectively unless you have a sort of a fundamental integration of rule of law.
Do you think there's a legal, but there's also a moral obligation?
I think it's both.
You made the point about failed states could interpret some of the legislations to their own agenda.
Yes, and to be frank, as my many reports to the General Assembly and the Human Rights Council, including those of my predecessors, it's not only failed states who are exploiting the great powers given to them by the post 9/11 counterterrorism architecture. Counterterrorism can be a shortcut for the state. We know that there's an ease sometimes in having rules that shortcut regular criminal procedure or rules of evidence or conditions of detention or length of trial or type of trial. It's often convenient for a state to use those exceptional powers rather than use the ordinary law. And I think we're starting to see again a similar pattern. We know that from domestic counterterrorism regulation. We're also starting to learn that from state practice in the field of global counterterrorism.
So do you think it's intentional abuse to achieve a political gain, or do you think it's coincidental to trying to do the right thing?
I think it depends. I don't think there's a global answer to that. I would say, and
there are cases of both, you would say.
There are cases of both, but let's be clear, the problem starts from a definitional one. At the national level, when states put in place their counterterrorism legislation, and states choose to craft the definition of terrorism in ways that includes, for example, disagreement with the state or insulting the leader, or then clearly we're way outside the realm of what the Security Council intended after 9/11. But I would say to you, and I think this is extremely well documented by my office, but also by other special rapporteurs, including Special Rapporteur on Torture, extrajudicial execution, freedom of assembly and expression, that actually states have been given the leeway, partly because there is no built-in human rights piece into the global counterterrorism architecture.
So who can police that? Is that the UN role? Who holds people accountable to the spirit of the regulation?
Who guards the guardians?
Yeah.
So I think the guardians have to start, and for me, and this was the report I delivered to the General Assembly last week, is I start with the Security Council. And my view is that the United Nations Charter requires states to comply to human rights. It's embedded in the Charter, Article 1 and Article 55. But that also means that when the United Nations, including the Security Council itself, acts, it has to act in human rights compliant ways, meaning this is an inward as well as an outward facing obligation. And so the Security Council has, I think, a particular obligation to guard its own legitimacy by, in fact, embedding human rights practice in its counterterrorism practice. And I actually believe that states are increasingly hearing that, because many states are concerned about the legitimacy of the regime. They see non-compliance. They understand that there are issues of non-compliance. And one of the reasons for that is when states see overreach and when they see their own domestic, constitutional and other protections for human rights being, if you want, somersaulted by Security Council diktat, then those countries will prove resistant, right? So it's both a legitimacy reason, it's also an efficiency argument, as well as a moral argument.
And it's legitimacy both for the government, but also there's legitimacy or lack of and reaction to by the people.
Right.
And so you bring it down to the local and the grassroots, because you have to try and engage, as we've said, the local requirement to the local drivers. So I just wanted to say that having you here and having you sort of remind the world about the obligation for human rights in the context of this has been to me one of the most useful components of the talk so far.
Thanks.
Because I think it's very easy to talk about the legislative, the military, the intelligence components, but we've got to bring it down to the human and the role of human rights. So for that afternoon, I really appreciate you coming.
Thank you.
Thank you for sharing.
Glad to be here.
And keep helping people educate and understand.
I'm glad to do that.
Much indeed.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.